On a peaceful suburban morning, a retired police officer noticed his former K-9 partner suddenly freeze in the middle of their living room. Instead of lounging lazily or seeking affection as he had done since retirement, this loyal yet powerful German shepherd stood rigid, ears perked, eyes focused with alarming intensity. When a distant siren wailed past their neighborhood, the dog's transformation was instantaneous, muscles tensed, posture shifted from pet to protector. What exactly triggered this veteran police dog's instinctive response, and why would a simple sound awaken years of forgotten training that had been dormant since leaving the force? The powerful animal that had once tracked down criminals and protected his handler now lived a life of comfortable retirement, yet in that moment, it was as if time had reversed. His eyes, once soft with contentment, now blazed with the focus and determination that had made him one of the department's most decorated K-9 officers. His powerful frame, which normally moved with the relaxed gait of a family pet, now held the coiled tension of a working police dog ready to deploy at a moment's notice. The transformation was so complete, so immediate, that it left his handler momentarily speechless, watching as years of civilian adjustment seemed to vanish in an instant. The siren continued its wailing path through the neighborhood, growing fainter with distance, but Max remained locked in place, awaiting commands that would not come, prepared to fulfill a duty that was no longer his responsibility. It was more than just a trained response. It was a window into the core of who this remarkable animal truly was beneath the surface of retirement, a glimpse of the guardian spirit that had once made him an invaluable partner on the dangerous streets they had patrolled together for 8 dedicated years. The dog's nostrils flared as he took in short, controlled breaths, the breathing pattern he had been trained to maintain during deployment when scenting for narcotics or tracking a suspect's trail. His tail, usually wagging lazily or curled comfortably as he lounged on his bed, now hung straight and motionless, the alert position that minimized movement and maximized focus. Even the way his weight shifted to the balls of his paws showed the muscle memory of thousands of hours of training and real-world application. Those paws, which now primarily traversed carpeted floors and grassy backyards, had once raced through rain-slicked alleys and climbed over chain-link fences in pursuit of those who fled from justice. That single siren had cut through the peaceful suburban morning like a key unlocking a hidden door, revealing that beneath the contented exterior of a retired K-9 still beat the heart of a police dog, loyal, vigilant, and forever ready to serve. The question hung in the air as tangibly as the fading echo of the siren: had Max ever truly retired in his mind, or had he simply been waiting, all this time, for the call to duty that his human partner had assumed would never come again? Michael Reynolds was no stranger to law enforcement transitions, having retired from the Chicago Police Department's K-9 unit 3 years ago after 2 decades of service. He was well acquainted with the challenges of adjusting to civilian life and the quieter rhythms that replaced sirens and radio calls. His suburban home, warm and inviting, stood as a testament to the peaceful retirement he had created for himself and his former partner, Max. Yet despite his experience helping his K-9 adjust to retirement, nothing could have prepared him for the powerful moment when Max's dormant instincts suddenly reawakened. The bond between handler and K-9 went deeper than most civilians could understand, forged through dangerous pursuits, tense standoffs, and countless midnight shifts where each relied on the other for survival. Michael had watched Max transition from the high-alert working dog to a more relaxed companion who enjoyed long walks and afternoon naps in sunlit corners of their home. The tactical vest and specialized equipment had been packed away, replaced by colorful toys and plush beds. The strict training regimen had given way to leisure walks and occasional games of fetch in the backyard. They had both grown a little older, a little slower, with Max's muzzle now showing distinguished gray hairs that matched the silver at Michael's temples. Their shared retirement had been peaceful, measured in small pleasures rather than arrests made or criminals apprehended. Michael often reflected on how well Max had adapted to civilian life, how the dog who once cleared buildings and tracked suspects now greeted neighborhood children with gentle patience and saved his energy for chasing tennis balls rather than fleeing suspects. The transition hadn't been immediate or always smooth. The first few months had been marked by Max's confusion, his expectant waiting by the door at the times they would normally have departed for their shift, his restless pacing when Michael put on a jacket similar to his uniform. There had been the challenges of helping Max understand that not every stranger was a potential threat, that the mailman approaching the house was not cause for alertness, that the sounds of car doors slamming in the night didn't require investigation. After breakfast came their morning walk around the neighborhood, a leisurely stroll rather than the purposeful patrols of their past. Michael no longer wore a uniform but comfortable jeans and a light jacket, no badge or weapon at his hip. Max no longer wore his tactical vest or working harness, just a simple collar with tags that identified him as a retired police K9. They followed the same route each day, down Maple Street, around the small community park, and back up Elm Avenue. Neighbors greeted them with friendly waves, some still addressing Max as "officer" out of respect for his years of service. Children would sometimes ask to pet him, and Michael would always explain the proper way to approach a former police dog, even though Max had grown quite tolerant in his retirement. The afternoon found them in the backyard, Michael brushing Max's thick coat as golden fur collected in piles on the patio. The repetitive motion seemed to suit them both, a quiet communion that required no words. Max's eyes would half close in contentment, occasionally nudging Michael's hand when he paused too long. The shedding brush had replaced the grooming techniques of their service days, when appearances needed to be maintained for public demonstrations and departmental inspections. Now, it was simply about comfort and the bonding that came with routine care. Michael took his time, paying special attention to the areas around Max's hips where arthritis sometimes troubled him after particularly active days. As the heat of the day increased, they retreated indoors to the cool comfort of air conditioning. Michael settled into his favorite armchair, a well-worn leather piece that had survived their move from the city apartment to this suburban sanctuary. He picked up the historical novel he'd been reading, enjoying the luxury of uninterrupted time, something that had been scarce during his years on the force. Max took his customary place on the plush dog bed positioned near the armchair, close enough for Michael to reach down and absently scratch behind his ears while turning pages. It was their afternoon ritual, this companionable silence broken only by the occasional turn of a page or Max's contented sigh. Through the partially open windows came the sounds of suburban life, lawn mowers in the distance, children's laughter from the house 2 doors down, the mail carrier's vehicle making its rounds. These noises had long since become background ambience to their peaceful retirement. Michael was deep into a chapter about ancient Roman military tactics when the first faint wail of a siren cut through the afternoon quiet. He barely registered it at first, having developed the ability to tune out such commonplace sounds after decades of hypervigilance. Emergency vehicles were simply part of daily life, especially with the main road to the hospital just a few blocks away. It was Max's sudden movement that caught Michael's attention. The soft rustling of fur against fabric as Max rose from his bed, the subtle change in the atmosphere of the room that any experienced officer learns to sense. Michael looked up from his book, his place lost as his focus shifted entirely to his former partner. What he saw caused the novel to slip from his fingers, falling unnoticed to the carpet beside his chair. Max stood perfectly erect in the middle of the living room, his transformation from relaxed pet to alert K9 officer so complete it was as though a different dog entirely had materialized in their home. His head was high, ears forward and pivoting to track the sound, eyes focused with laser intensity on the front door. The casual observer might not have noticed the subtle weight shift to his front paws, the slight lowering of his center of gravity, but Michael recognized the stance immediately. It was the exact position Max had assumed hundreds of times before, whenever the radio in their patrol car had crackled with a code indicating they were needed for an emergency response. Max's muscular frame trembled with tension, eyes fixed on the door, ears swiveled toward the sound. Instead of barking or pacing anxiously, he stood with a disciplined stillness that Michael hadn't witnessed since their days on patrol. His posture reflected years of rigorous training, the thousands of hours spent learning to channel his natural instincts into controlled responses. The powerful muscles beneath his fur, which had softened slightly with the gentler pace of retirement, now rippled with renewed purpose. Every fiber of his being seemed poised on a knife's edge between restraint and action. This wasn't the random alertness of a pet dog hearing an unusual noise. This was the calculated readiness of a professional awaiting deployment. Michael's heart quickened as he observed this sudden shift. His own body responded instinctively, adrenaline coursing through his veins as it had during countless calls to service. For a moment, he found himself mentally reaching for a radio that no longer hung at his shoulder, his fingers twitching with the memory of calling in their position and status. Police dogs were, after all, trained to respond to specific triggers with precision and purpose. The siren was more than just a sound to Max, it was a signal that had once meant duty, danger, and the need for his specialized skills. It represented the core purpose for which he had been selected as a puppy, the foundation of his intensive training, and the cornerstone of his working identity. But this dog had been peacefully retired for 3 years, gradually adjusting to a life without the adrenaline and responsibility of police work. They had established new routines, created different associations, formed fresh habits. The tactical training sessions had been replaced with casual play. The strict boundaries of working behavior had relaxed into the more forgiving expectations of a family pet. Or so Michael had believed. The evidence standing before him suggested otherwise, that beneath the veneer of retirement, Max's working instincts remained intact, merely dormant until the right stimulus awakened them. In that moment, watching Max's training resurface so powerfully, Michael felt a complex wave of emotions crash over him. There was pride, certainly, pride in the excellence of Max's training, in his unwavering dedication to duty even years after his service had ended. There was nostalgia for their working partnership, for the unique bond forged through shared danger and purpose. But there was also a twinge of concern that cut through these warmer feelings like a cold blade. What did this response reveal about Max's true adjustment to retirement? Had Michael misjudged his partner's contentment with civilian life? Had he been selfish in assuming that Max could simply set aside the purpose that had defined most of his conscious existence? Michael studied the German shepherd's face, noting the intense focus in his amber eyes, the alert positioning of his ears, the slight forward tilt of his head as he processed the sound of the siren. There was something almost yearning in his expression, not anxiety or distress, but what Michael could only interpret as eager readiness. It was the look Max had given him countless times while waiting for the command to track a suspect or search a building. It spoke of purpose, of partnership, of the deep-seated need to fulfill the role for which he had been trained. What was happening in Max's mind as these dormant instincts reawakened? Was he experiencing confusion between his retired present and his working past? Was he struggling to reconcile the surge of alertness with the absence of the familiar commands and routines that would normally follow? And if these memories and training patterns were so easily triggered by something as common as a passing siren, had Max truly adjusted to retirement at all? Or was a part of him still waiting, day after day, for the call to service that never came, for the chance to once again fulfill the purpose that had given structure and meaning to his life? As the siren faded into the distance, these questions hung in the air between handler and dog, forcing Michael to reconsider everything he thought he understood about their shared retirement. The comfortable routines they had established, the peaceful coexistence they had cultivated, all of it now seemed like a thin veneer over deeper waters neither of them had fully explored. For the first time since hanging up his badge, Michael wondered if he had done right by his partner in bringing him into retirement alongside him. Or had he, with the best of intentions, denied something essential to Max's nature and identity? Michael sat motionless in his armchair, heart pounding as he watched Max's transformation. The siren grew louder, likely an ambulance or patrol car passing through their neighborhood toward the highway. The flashing lights were now visible through the gaps in the blinds, casting intermittent blue and red patterns across the living room walls. Max's eyes never wavered from the door, his breathing measured and controlled as though preparing for action. There was a dignity in his alertness that tugged at Michael's heart, the visible evidence of thousands of hours of training still perfectly preserved in muscle memory. Yet the longer Michael observed his partner's poised vigilance, the more he became convinced that this wasn't a moment for intervention but for respect. This wasn't a behavior to be corrected or redirected. This was Max's essence revealing itself, a glimpse of the working dog that still lived within the retired companion. The realization brought with it an unexpected clarity. Perhaps retirement didn't mean erasing the past, but finding healthy ways to honor it. With careful movements, he set aside his book and quietly approached Max, stopping a few feet away to give him space. Michael was mindful not to stand directly between the dog and the door, respecting the invisible line of Max's focused attention. "It's okay, boy," he murmured, not to break the dog's focus but to acknowledge it. His voice was pitched in the same calm, confident tone he had used during their working days, not the higher, more casual voice he typically used in their retirement interactions. Max's ear twitched slightly at Michael's voice, the only indication that he had registered his handler's presence. Otherwise, his stance remained unchanged, a living statue of his former working self. His tail, normally loose and relaxed, hung motionless in the alert position that had once communicated to Michael that his partner had detected something requiring attention. The muscles in his hindquarters tensed slightly as the siren reached its peak volume, as if preparing for the command to move that had always followed this exact sequence of cues during their years of service. The emergency vehicle passed directly in front of their house now, bathing the living room in flashes of blue and red through the window blinds. The wail of the siren reached its crescendo, filling the space with the urgent sound that had once been the soundtrack to their most intense moments together. For a heartbeat, Michael found himself mentally running through the checklist they would have followed: equipment check, location confirmation, tactical approach plan. The routine was still there, buried beneath years of civilian habits but not erased. Max took a single step forward, muscles coiled with purpose, then stopped at the invisible boundary of his training, awaiting a command that wouldn't come. This hesitation, this perfect balance between action and restraint, showcased the excellence of his training. Even after years away from service, he remembered that movement without explicit command was not permitted. He held himself in perfect readiness, a tool awaiting the hand of his master, a partner waiting for confirmation from his team member. Michael moved slightly closer, carefully extending his hand to rest it lightly on Max's back. He could feel the tension vibrating through the dog's body, the controlled energy humming beneath his palm. "Stand down, partner," he said quietly, using the specific phrase that had signaled the end of an alert during their working days. It felt strange on his lips after so long, like speaking a language he had once been fluent in but had not used for years. The response was subtle but immediate. Something in Max's posture shifted, not a complete relaxation, but a slight easing of the most intense vigilance. His breathing, which had been shallow and controlled, deepened slightly. His weight shifted back to an even distribution across all four paws rather than the forward-ready stance of imminent action. He was responding to the command, following the protocol embedded in years of partnership, yet his attention remained fixed on the door, tracking the sound as it began to recede. As the siren faded into the distance, taking with it the flashing lights that had transformed their living room, Michael maintained gentle contact with Max, standing beside him rather than attempting to direct him away from his vigil. There was something profoundly moving about sharing this moment of remembered purpose, about witnessing the depth of training and dedication that remained despite the passage of time and the changes in their circumstances. Only when the last echoes of the siren had disappeared completely did Max finally turn his head to look at Michael, his amber eyes still bright with alertness but now seeking confirmation, connection. The question in those eyes was clear enough for Michael to read after their years together: did I do well? Was my response correct? Was I still good at my job? "Good boy," Michael said softly, feeling the inadequacy of those simple words to convey the complex emotions surging through him: pride, nostalgia, and a new understanding that perhaps retirement for a working dog wasn't about leaving everything behind, but about carrying forward the best parts of that identity into a new chapter. As the siren began to fade into the distance, Michael observed subtle shifts in Max's demeanor. The rigid posture gradually softened, though his attentiveness remained. His ears, which had been locked forward tracking the sound, now occasionally flicked toward other noises in the house. The intense focus in his eyes diluted slightly, allowing more of his surroundings to enter his awareness. It wasn't a complete stand down, more like a gradual step down from high alert to a milder vigilance. Recognizing this critical moment of transition, Michael moved to the kitchen and retrieved Max's favorite training reward, a special treat he hadn't used since their service days. The weathered tin container had been pushed to the back of a cupboard, reserved for occasions that had never quite presented themselves in retirement. The familiar sound of the treat container opening caught Max's attention, creating a bridge between his two worlds. The subtle click of the metal lid was distinctive, different from the everyday treats kept in a ceramic jar on the counter. This sound had once signified recognition of duty fulfilled, of expectations met with excellence. Max turned, his gaze momentarily torn between the door and his handler, before making a deliberate choice to approach Michael. It was a small victory, the first acknowledgement that the immediate response to the siren was complete. "Good boy," Michael said softly, offering the reward with the same hand signal he'd used during their years of service. His fingers formed the specific gesture that had always accompanied successful completion of a task, muscle memory taking over after years without practice. Max accepted it with the gentle precision he'd been trained for, not as a pet taking a treat but as a working dog acknowledging a job recognized. His teeth barely grazed Michael's fingers as he took the morsel with the careful restraint that had been drilled into him from puppyhood. Despite years away from formal work, the protocols remained intact, perfect recall of behaviors practiced thousands of times. Michael felt a profound melancholy wash over him as he watched Max consume the reward. How many times had Max heard those sirens and waited with this same disciplined patience for Michael's command to spring into action? The shepherd had spent 8 years of his life learning to respond to those cues, to associate them with purpose and duty. From his selection as a promising puppy through the intensive training at the academy, through thousands of patrol hours and hundreds of deployments, Max had been conditioned to understand sirens as calls to service, as indicators that his specialized skills were needed. Retirement, while peaceful, had abruptly ended that sense of mission. There had been no gradual reduction in duties, no tapering of responsibility. One day they were full-service members of the K-9 unit, and the next day they were civilians, with all the attendant identity shifts such a transition demanded. Michael had at least had the benefit of choosing his retirement, of mentally preparing for the change. Max had simply followed his handler's lead, adapting to new routines out of the same loyalty and trust that had characterized their working relationship. Settling on the floor beside Max, Michael began gently stroking the area behind his ears where gray hairs now peppered the once solid black fur. The texture was slightly coarser than it had been in Max's prime, another small reminder of the passage of time. "You never really forget, do you?" he murmured, watching as Max gradually relaxed, sinking onto his haunches while maintaining a dignified alertness. There was something almost wistful in the dog's expression now, as though the brief reawakening of his working instincts had stirred memories that weren't easily dismissed. Michael's fingers traced a small scar above Max's right eye, a souvenir from a fence-jumping pursuit in their 3rd year together. Each mark, each gray hair told a story of their service: the midnight drug busts, the missing person searches in driving rain, the tense standoffs where Max's authoritative presence had often prevented the need for more forceful intervention. These experiences had shaped them both, forging a connection that transcended the typical bond between human and dog. They had relied on each other in life-or-death situations, had developed a silent communication system built on absolute trust. "Did you miss it?" Michael asked quietly, knowing no verbal answer would come but reading Max's body language with the fluency of long partnership. The subtle shift in Max's posture at the question, the way his ears perked forward at Michael's serious tone, suggested an understanding that went beyond words. There was a recognition passing between them, an acknowledgement that beneath the comfortable routines of retirement, certain fundamentals remained unchanged. The training, the instincts, the sense of purpose that had defined their working years hadn't disappeared, they had merely been dormant, waiting for the right stimulus to reawaken them. For the first time since their retirement, Michael allowed himself to consider whether the clean break from their former life had truly been in Max's best interest. Had he projected his own desire for peaceful retirement onto his partner? Max had been only 10 when they retired, older for a working dog, certainly, but not yet debilitated by age. His skills had still been sharp, his drive still evident. It had seemed the right time to step back, to give Max the chance to experience life without the demands and dangers of police work. But watching him now, seeing how readily and perfectly he had snapped back into his working mindset, Michael wondered if something essential had been lost in the transition. Later that evening, Michael found himself unable to shake the day's event from his mind. While Max had eventually returned to his normal retired routine, napping, following Michael around the house, engaging in brief play sessions, something about his instantaneous transformation had left Michael unsettled. The perfect recall of training, the immediate shift in bearing, the focused intensity in his eyes, all of it suggested that Max's retirement had been more of a pause than an end to his working identity. Scrolling through his phone, Michael paused on old photos from their service years, Max in his tactical vest, the two of them at graduation from K-9 training, medals and commendations they'd earned together. The images triggered memories of their countless midnight shifts, dangerous apprehensions, and life-saving searches. There was the night they had tracked a missing child through 2 miles of dense woodland, finding her huddled and hypothermic but alive. The drug bust that had earned Max a special commendation from the commissioner. The standoff where Max's mere presence had convinced an armed suspect to surrender without violence. Each photo represented not just events but a shared sense of mission, a clarity of purpose that had defined both their lives. The contrast between the alert, mission-focused Max of those photographs and the seemingly contented retired companion he had become was striking. Yet today's response to the Siren had blurred that distinction, revealing that the working dog in the photo still existed beneath the surface of retirement. The realization brought with it a mixture of pride and concern. Pride in the excellence of Max's training and his unwavering dedication to duty. Concern that perhaps Max's apparent adjustment to retirement was incomplete, or worse, that it masked an unfulfilled need for the purpose and structure that had once defined his existence. "I thought we'd both adjusted," Michael said aloud, glancing at Max who lay nearby, ears perking at his handler's voice. The shepherd lifted his head, attentive as always to Michael's tone and body language. In that simple response, Michael saw echoes of their working communication, the constant awareness, the readiness to engage. But maybe adjustment isn't the same as forgetting. A text message interrupted his thoughts, a former colleague from the K-9 unit checking in. John Ramirez had been Michael's supervisor during their last 3 years on the force, and he still occasionally reached out, particularly on anniversaries of significant cases or department events. The message was casual, asking how retirement was treating them both, mentioning recent developments at the unit. Acting on impulse, Michael described what had happened with Max and the Siren, detailing the dog's dramatic response and his own conflicted feelings about what it might mean. The response came quickly, the phone buzzing in Michael's hand. Not surprising. Those instincts never fully disappear. Some handlers bring retired K-9s to the station occasionally. Gives them a sense of still being connected to purpose. Might be worth considering. Michael stared at the message, conflicted. Was John suggesting that complete separation from their former life had been a mistake? That Max needed some connection to his working past to be truly content? He looked over at his partner, now sleeping peacefully on his bed in the corner of the living room. Max's legs occasionally twitched in his sleep, his paws making small running motions against the fabric of his bed. Was he dreaming of pursuits? Of tracking? Of the work that had once been his daily reality? The suggestion to visit the station stirred mixed feelings. On one hand, it might provide Max with beneficial mental stimulation and a sense of continued connection to the work that had been so central to his life. On the other hand, would it only confuse him, blurring the boundaries between retirement and service in ways that might ultimately cause frustration? And there were practical concerns as well. Max was older now, his hips occasionally troubling him after particularly active days. The questions nagged at Michael as he dimmed the lights, preparing for bed. Tomorrow would bring their usual routine, the morning walk, the afternoon rest, perhaps some simple training exercises to keep Max's mind active. But now, those routine activities seemed insufficient, lacking the depth of engagement and purpose that had characterized Max's response to the Siren. As he looked back at his sleeping partner before heading to the bedroom, Michael made a mental note to call John tomorrow. Perhaps it was time to reconsider what retirement should look like for a dog who had dedicated his life to service, and what might be missing from their current arrangement. The following afternoon, Michael took Max for their usual walk through the neighborhood park. The routine had become comfortable for both of them, a gentle exercise that maintained Max's health without taxing his aging joints. The path they followed wound through carefully landscaped gardens and around a small central pond, a far cry from the urban streets and alleyways they had once patrolled together. Children played on nearby swings, elderly couples sat on benches feeding birds, and joggers passed with friendly nods of recognition. It was a peaceful scene, one that represented everything their retirement was supposed to be about: safety, leisure, the absence of the danger and urgency that had characterized their working years. Max walked with dignified composure at Michael's side, no leash tension, maintaining the perfect heel position that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of training. Even in retirement, he rarely strayed more than a few feet from Michael's left leg, the working position so deeply ingrained that it had become his natural walking pattern. Occasionally his nose would dip toward an interesting scent, but a subtle change in Michael's pace was usually enough to bring his attention back to their synchronized movement. The unconscious communication between them remained fluid and effective, a testament to their years of partnership. As they rounded the pond, disaster struck in the form of a teenager on a skateboard who lost control coming down a nearby path. The board shot out from under his feet, clattering loudly across the pavement as the boy shouted in alarm. The sound was sharp and sudden, a chaotic disruption of the park's tranquility that echoed across the open space. It was precisely the kind of unpredictable disturbance that would have once signaled potential danger during their patrol days, the sort of commotion that often preceded confrontations or required official intervention. The sudden commotion triggered something in Max. His body stiffened, head whipping toward the sound as his training interpreted the chaos as a potential threat. The transformation was immediate and complete, the relaxed retirement demeanor vanished, replaced by the alert, ready posture of a working police dog. His ears locked forward, his tail straightened, and muscles that had been relaxed moments before now coiled with sudden tension. Before Michael could tighten his grip, Max lunged forward with surprising strength, the leash burning through Michael's fingers as the shepherd rushed toward the perceived danger. "Max! Halt!" Michael commanded, his voice instinctively shifting to the firm, authoritative tone of their working days. The words came without conscious thought, pulled from years of field experience rather than their gentle retirement interactions. His tone carried the unmistakable authority of a K9 handler in a critical situation, cutting through the ambient noise of the park with commanding clarity. To his immense relief, Max stopped abruptly, feet planted, eyes still locked on the skateboard and bewildered teenager. The command had penetrated the surge of instinct, accessing the deep training that prioritized handler control above all else. Even in the grip of his protective response, the foundation of obedience remained intact. He stood frozen in perfect obedience, quivering slightly with the effort of restraining his forward momentum, waiting for the next command that would tell him how to proceed. Heart pounding, Michael approached cautiously, aware that curious onlookers had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Parents pulled children closer, joggers slowed their pace, all eyes drawn to the powerful German shepherd standing at alert in the middle of the pathway. Max's reputation in the neighborhood as a friendly retired police dog made this display of his working capabilities all the more dramatic for those watching. He was no longer just the gentle animal who allowed children to pet him under supervision, but visibly a trained law enforcement asset capable of immediate response. He reached Max and placed a steady hand on his back, feeling the tremors of adrenaline running through the dog's body. The muscles beneath his palm were rock-hard with tension, his breathing rapid but controlled. Michael could sense the conflict within his partner, the ingrained response to potential threat battling with the equally powerful training to obey handler commands without question. "Easy, partner," he murmured, reverting to the calming techniques they'd used after intense situations in the field. His voice lowered to a pitch that only Max could hear, creating a bubble of communication between them amid the public setting. "We're retired now, not our call." The familiar phrases seemed to penetrate Max's heightened state, his breathing gradually slowing though his attention remained fixed on the teenager, who was now retrieving his skateboard with nervous glances toward the dog. The teenager, having gathered his board and his composure, approached nervously. He was perhaps 15, lanky and awkward in the way of adolescents still growing into their height. His expression showed concern rather than fear, his hands visible in a gesture that seemed instinctively designed to appear non-threatening. "Is your dog okay?" "I'm really sorry about the noise," he said, keeping a respectful distance. Michael maintained his position between Max and the perceived disturbance, one hand still steadying his partner while his body language communicated controlled authority to both the boy and any watching bystanders. "He's a retired police K9, Michael explained, his voice calmer now but still carrying the natural command presence of his years in law enforcement. Loud, sudden noises can trigger his training response." The teen's eyes widened with interest rather than fear, looking at Max with newfound appreciation. "Whoa, really? That's awesome. What kind of work did he do?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity, the skateboard incident already receding in importance as this new information took precedence. As Michael briefly explained Max's career in narcotics detection and suspect apprehension, he felt the tension gradually leave Max's body. The shepherd remained vigilant but no longer poised to act, his posture shifting incrementally from working alert to watchful observation. The teenager listened with evident fascination, asking thoughtful questions about training techniques and memorable cases, his initial nervousness replaced by respectful interest. The incident had shaken Michael more deeply than he cared to admit, not from fear of what Max might have done, but from the realization that beneath their peaceful retirement routine, both of them were still carrying pieces of their former identities. Max's instantaneous shift from retired pet to working police dog had been seamless, perfect in its execution despite years away from active duty. And Michael's own response had been equally telling, the command voice, the tactical positioning, the public management techniques all emerging without conscious thought, as though a part of him remained perpetually on duty despite the civilian clothes and relaxed surroundings. As they continued their walk, now heading toward home, Michael found himself unusually quiet, processing the implications of what had just occurred. Max walked obediently at his side, outwardly calm but with a new alertness to his surroundings, as though the skateboard incident had reactivated surveillance patterns dormant since retirement. The peaceful afternoon had been disrupted not just by the teenager's accident, but by the uncomfortable questions it raised about their shared transition from service to civilian life. That evening, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Sarah Chen, the K-9 trainer who had originally paired Michael and Max 8 years ago. Michael had reached out to her after the park incident, seeking professional insight, but hadn't expected her to drive over immediately. He felt a wave of déjà vu watching Max's reaction to her knock, the alert posture, the focused attention, though this time without the intensity triggered by the Siren or skateboard incidents. There was recognition in Max's demeanor as Michael opened the door, a subtle shift from vigilance to something approaching eagerness. "I was curious to see how he's doing," Sarah explained, kneeling to greet Max with the practiced movements of someone accustomed to interacting with working dogs. Her hands moved confidently, checking his stance and condition even as she offered affection. Max responded with enthusiastic tail wagging, a stark contrast to his usual reserved demeanor with visitors. He recognized her not just as a familiar human but as someone connected to his working life, someone who spoke the language of commands and expectations that had structured his development. 3 years is a long retirement for a working dog. Sarah hadn't changed much since Michael had last seen her at their retirement ceremony. Her dark hair was pulled back in the same practical ponytail, her clothing still the functional attire of someone who worked primarily outdoors with animals. The lines around her eyes had deepened slightly, but her movements maintained the deliberate precision that made her so effective with K9s. She had been the one to spot Max's potential as a puppy, to guide him through his initial training, and to match him with Michael based on complementary temperaments and working styles. Michael explained the recent incidents while Sarah observed Max with a trained eye, the siren response, the skateboard reaction, the perfect recall of commands that hadn't been used in years. As he spoke, Max settled nearby, his gaze constantly returning to Sarah's training bag with evident interest. The familiar scent of equipment and training aids clearly triggered associations that casual visitors never activated. He's physically healthy, maintaining good weight, but there's something in his eyes that seems, I don't know, restless maybe. Michael concluded, watching as Max's attention shifted between them with the focused intensity that had been his hallmark as a working dog. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful as she completed her assessment. K9s are purpose-bred and purpose-trained. Their identities are built around having a job, she explained, opening her bag to retrieve a notepad. Max's ears immediately perked forward at the sound, his body tensing slightly in anticipation. Even with the best retirement care, they can experience something similar to what human officers call shield hunger, missing the sense of meaning that comes with the work. The term struck Michael with unexpected force. Shield hunger. He'd heard it used by colleagues who struggled with civilian transition, who missed the purpose and brotherhood of law enforcement. He'd experienced milder versions himself in those first months after turning in his badge, the instinctive reaching for equipment that was no longer there, the hypervigilance in public spaces, the assessment of situations through a tactical lens even when off-duty. But he'd never considered that Max might experience a K9 equivalent. But he's got a good life here, Michael protested mildly, gesturing around the comfortable home they shared. Regular exercise, good food, comfort, attention. He seems content most of the time. Even as he said it, Michael recognized the defensiveness in his tone, the natural resistance to the suggestion that he might have overlooked something important in his partner's well-being. And that's all essential, Sarah agreed, her tone gentle but firm. You've given him excellent care. His physical condition is impressive for a dog his age. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. But it might not be complete. Think of it this way, you chose to retire, made the transition on your terms. Max simply followed you because that's what partners do. The observation struck Michael deeply, hitting a nerve he hadn't realized was exposed. He'd spent months planning for retirement, setting up their new home, creating financial stability, mentally preparing for the shift in identity. Max had been brought along into this new life without consultation, his transition determined entirely by Michael's choices. It was the nature of the handler, K9 relationship, of course, working dogs didn't get to make career decisions. But the implications of that reality now seemed more complex than Michael had previously considered. "So what are you suggesting?" Michael asked, watching as Max's ears perked up at the serious tone in his voice. The shepherd's attention had sharpened, as though he sensed the conversation concerned him directly. Sarah reached into her bag and removed a training aid, a special scent pouch used to maintain detection skills. The moment the pouch appeared, Max's entire demeanor transformed. His nostrils flared, his posture straightened, and his eyes locked onto the object with the intense focus that had made him such an effective narcotics detector. This wasn't the mild interest of a pet offered a new toy, but the switched-on engagement of a professional presented with working equipment. "I'm suggesting that retirement doesn't have to mean abandoning every aspect of what gave him purpose," Sarah explained, watching Max's reaction with professional assessment. "There are programs where retired K9s participate in demonstrations for schools, limited training sessions to keep their minds active, even therapy work with veterans. Activities that honor their training and abilities without the physical demands or dangers of actual police work." She handed the scent pouch to Michael, who held it with a strange mixture of familiarity and distance. How many training sessions had they conducted with similar aids? How many successful operations had begun with Max alerting to substances hidden in packages just like this one? The memory of those days felt simultaneously distant and immediate, as though no time had passed at all. "It's about finding balance," Sarah continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Acknowledging who he is at his core while respecting his current limitations. Just as you've had to find ways to carry your law enforcement experience into civilian life, Max needs bridges between his working identity and his retirement reality." With Sarah's guidance, Michael developed a balanced plan for Max's retirement, one that honored his working heritage while respecting his advancing age. They set up weekly visits to the training center where Max could engage in light scent detection exercises, more as mental stimulation than actual work. The familiar routines and equipment visibly energized him, bringing back the focused attention and purposeful movements that had characterized his service years, but in a controlled environment without the physical demands of full duty. Michael's former department welcomed them for occasional visits, where Max was greeted with enthusiasm by officers who remembered his contributions. During one such visit, Max was allowed to sit in a patrol car again, his posture immediately shifting to that attentive, ready stance Michael recognized from countless shifts together. He didn't fidget or pant anxiously as most pets would in a confined space. Instead, he settled into perfect working position, eyes forward, ears alert, completely in his element. "Look at him," remarked Captain Torres, who had supervised the K9 unit. "He still remembers exactly how to position himself. It's in his blood." The observation carried no surprise, just respect for the depth of training and natural aptitude that had made Max an exceptional police dog. The officers treated him not as a pet brought for a nostalgic visit, but as a respected colleague temporarily returned from retirement. Most significantly, Michael connected with a local veterans center that worked with therapy animals. Max's calm, disciplined demeanor made him ideal for visits with former service members, particularly those struggling with PTSD who responded well to the structured interaction a former working dog provided. Unlike typical therapy dogs, Max brought a unique understanding of service, duty, and the challenges of transitioning to civilian life, qualities that resonated deeply with veterans facing similar adjustments. During their first session, Michael watched in quiet amazement as Max gently approached a withdrawn veteran who had barely spoken to therapists. The man sat alone in a corner of the recreation room, physically present but emotionally distant. Max, without prompting from Michael, walked directly to him and sat at attention, offering his presence without demanding response. The shepherd's dignified bearing seemed to communicate a wordless understanding that transcended species barriers. The veteran's face softened as he ran his hand over Max's head, the first voluntary engagement he'd shown in weeks according to the center's staff. His touch was tentative at first, then more confident as Max maintained his calm, attentive posture. "Military or police?" the veteran asked quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "Police, narcotics detection and patrol. 8 years of service," Michael replied, maintaining a respectful distance while staying close enough to supervise the interaction. He didn't elaborate or push conversation, allowing the veteran to set the pace of engagement. The veteran nodded with understanding, his hand continuing its steady stroking of Max's fur. "He's still standing at attention even when he's relaxed. You can take the dog out of the service, but you can't take the service out of the dog." The observation was made with the insight of someone intimately familiar with the mindset created by years of specialized training and high-stakes responsibility. For Michael, that simple observation crystallized what he'd been learning. Max would always carry his training within him. It wasn't something to suppress or ignore, but rather something to honor and channel appropriately. The instincts and behaviors that made him an exceptional police dog weren't mistakes to be corrected in retirement, but fundamental aspects of his identity to be respected and accommodated. The months that followed brought a new rhythm to Michael and Max's retirement. Their home remained a place of peace and rest, but their life expanded to include these purposeful activities that acknowledged Max's working heritage. The balance seemed to suit Max perfectly. His energy levels improved, his occasional restlessness diminished, and the gray around his muzzle seemed less pronounced against his increasingly bright eyes. On summer evenings, Michael would often sit on his porch watching Max patrol the perimeter of their fenced yard, not anxiously, but with the methodical thoroughness of his training. This wasn't a behavior Michael discouraged anymore. He recognized it as an essential expression of Max's nature. The German Shepherd wasn't anxiously searching for threats, but rather engaging in the surveillance patterns that had structured much of his conscious life. It was no different, Michael reflected, than his own habit of scanning rooms for exits or assessing strangers in public spaces, not paranoia, but training too deeply ingrained to disappear entirely. The siren still caused Max's ears to perk up, his body to tense momentarily in anticipation, but these reactions no longer concerned Michael. Instead, he would acknowledge them with a gentle pat and sometimes the special phrase from their working days, "Not our call, partner." The words seemed to satisfy something in Max, providing closure to the instinctive response rather than simply ignoring it. In the corner of their living room, Michael had created a small display with Max's service collar, badges, and awards, a reminder that retirement wasn't about erasing the past but building upon it. Beside these mementos sat new photographs, Max sitting calmly with veterans, demonstrating scent detection for schoolchildren, receiving an honorary retirement badge from the department. Each image captured a moment of purpose, of connection, of continued contribution adjusted to suit their new reality. "You've earned both worlds, boy," Michael would say during their quiet moments together. Where once he had worried about Max's adjustment to civilian life, he now understood that true adjustment wasn't about forgetting or replacing, but integrating past and present into a meaningful whole. Max wasn't just a retired police dog struggling to be a pet, nor was he a working dog frustrated by retirement limitations. He was a complex individual with a rich history, capabilities, and needs that spanned both identities. If this story of service, transition, and understanding touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed the powerful bond between working animals and their handlers, or experienced the challenge of helping a service animal adjust to retirement? Share your experiences below, we'd love to hear them. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for more stories that celebrate the unbreakable bonds formed through service and dedication. From the K9 units protecting our communities to the loyal companions in our homes, these remarkable animals remind us that purpose and connection can take many forms throughout a lifetime.